Hey you, yes you, it's time to assassinate your nearest Habsburg heir and invade your nearest Poland because it's World War Wednesday, which unfortunately due to scheduling issues has been moved to a Thursday. Today we'll be looking at the worst World War I general, all of them. World War I is not known for having the best military leadership, and regardless whether that is a fair assessment or not, it still does not disregard the fact that there were quite a few rock eaters and glue sniffers in charge of various European armies. But when thinking of the worst general of the conflict, to me, one man comes to mind, one who led not only his own country, but the entire world to disaster. That man's name is Conrad Von Hotzendorf. Mainland Europe after the First World War had four empires that fell, those being the German, Russian, Ottoman, and of course Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria-Hungary, as the name implies, was an empire split into two halves, the Austrian half and the Hungarian half. To grossly oversimplify, this was because during the 19th century, Hungary tried to kill Austria so many times that they agreed to give them their own parliament and autonomy. The empire was more than just Austrians and Hungarians, however. There were also Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Romanians, Italians, Ukrainians, Slovenes, Serbs, Croats, and probably some others I'm forgetting. All these ethnic groups were generally destabilizing, as many of these groups not only resented their lack of representation, but some wanted outright independence. But honestly, the best way to see how this is a bad thing is just to put all these different people in a room together. It was in this empire that today's antagonist, bumbling idiot, was born on the 11th of November 1852. We won't cover much of his early life, but his father was a retired army colonel also called Conrad Von Hotzendorf. Conrad also chose the military life, and after studying to become an officer, he was posted in various positions ranging from battalions to divisions. He distinguished himself as an innovative military thinker and tactician, although he did subscribe to the throw men at the enemy tactic. But this was pretty common at the time, so we won't say it's a Conrad exclusive issue. He got the attention of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of assassination fame, who recommended Conrad as Chief of General Staff to Kaiser Franz Joseph. During his post prior to war, he stressed the importance of military modernization in both equipment and tactics. This is one of the strange things about Conrad. In terms of military tactics, he was competent if not better than his contemporaries, but what made Conrad the worst general in the war, in my not so humble opinion, I'm always right, was his strategy, in both terms how he managed the army in the conflict, and more importantly, his incompetency in geopolitics. It was German General Helmut von Moltke the Elder who famously referred to Europe as a powder barrel. He foresaw many of the dangers of modern European conflict could bring. He explained it could be a 7 or even a 30 years war, and finished his speech exclaiming, "And woe to the man who sets Europe ablaze, who first throws the match into the powder keg." In this regard, Conrad just didn't have a box of matches, he had a fucking flamethrower. In the 7 years prior to 1914, he recommended that Austria-Hungary went to war not 1, not 5, 50 times. He was deadass trying to complete the get 50 million people killed per any percent speedrun. A good example for his advocacy for war was during the Bosnian crisis. In 1908, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, which although occupied by Austria-Hungary, technically belonged to the Ottoman Turks. In 1908, the Dual Monarchy officially annexed the region. This caused a crisis between the European powers that nearly led to a war. Throughout the crisis, as you'd expect, Conrad advocated repeatedly for war, but luckily cooler heads prevailed and the war was avoided, even if the crisis did cement the European alliance system and made the next crisis likely to result in a European fortnight battle royale. Conrad was raging that his opportunity for war had been lost, with him confiding in a friend, "With the resolution of the Balkan crisis, 1,000 hopes were buried for me." Fortunately for Conrad, but not for literally every other human being alive at that point, the next major European crisis would not end in peace. In 1914, the man who got Conrad his job, Franz Ferdinand, went to the city in Sarajevo in recently annexed Bosnia on the anniversary of a battle that symbolized kicking out invaders, so obviously people wanted him dead. After a failed attempt, he was rightfully advised to leave, but Franz Ferdinand isn't known for hunting over 300,000 animals, he's known for being shotted. So when he went to visit the soldiers injured by a grenade in one of the failed attempts, on the way the chauffeur pulled the worst wrong turn in history, which led him to be introduced to the assassin Grivalou Princip, who introduced a bullet into Ferdinand's neck. This led to the biggest European crisis yet, with ultimatums being sent, blank checks being given, with it all culminating in Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia. Conrad's mentality to the crisis was best described by the Dual Monarchy's foreign minister, that being war, war, war. He was determined not to let this crisis end like the Bosnian one. Although there's many men who could be blamed for the crisis leading to the war, it can be argued one of the most responsible was Conrad von Hotzendorf. As for preparations for the war, Conrad being Conrad failed miserably at this too. He way overestimated the strength of his army. It was best suited to maintaining order in the fragile empire and not sort of any large-scale offensive war. But probably the most egregious aspect of pre-war preparations was his plans for troop deployment and mobilization. The two most likely enemies in any future war were Serbia and Russia. They both were allies and it was pretty much guaranteed that war with one would mean war with the other. Despite knowing this, knowing full well of the German Schlieffen plan, Conrad's mobilization plans only accounted for war with Russia, war case R, or Serbia, war case B, meaning that when the war came in 1914, they had set out no real plans for troop deployment. Conrad decided to focus his efforts south against Serbia, mostly because he left his emotions and his desire to punish Serbia override any sensible thinking. But as the troops were nearly in place for a Serbian offensive, he could no longer ignore the fact that Russia was mobilizing, and fast. This caused him to divert a large portion of the southern army to the east, in order to hold out against the Russians while Germany could defeat France and then turn east. But then after getting confirmation that Romania wouldn't join the war on Russia's side, Conrad got a bit too big for his boots. Thus he drastically changed the plan for eastern deployments, meaning that the troops intended for the flanks were concentrated in Russian Poland for a grand offensive. This was in violation to the agreements he made to his allies, by the way. Not only that, he made the troops march there rather than transport them via rail, meaning when they arrived at the front they were exhausted after travelling 100 miles extra than necessary. However, when the Austro-Hungarian army finally got into action, they failed miserably. What, were you expecting me to say something else? Starting with the Serbian front, the grand opening offensive began on the 12th of August. The Austro-Hungarians outnumbered the Serbians by at least 60,000 men. They made their way into Serbia, only for a surprise Serbian counterattack which inflicted 100,000 casualties. The Serbians had more field experience from the recent Balkan War, and when combined with Conrad's failure to mobilize correctly, it led to his army being ousted by Serbian territory by the end of the month. Things were in no way better on the eastern front, despite the Russian high command being in a competence competition with the Austro-Hungarians, and despite some initial successes, the four Austro-Hungarian armies in the east were defeated, in large part due to inadequate supply lines, and even larger part because they found a force bigger than like 4 dudes, and communication was just as effective, as you'd think for a country with over 14 different languages. Final blunder at the opening stage of the war was sending his cavalry to attack en masse into Russian Poland, which did nothing more than provided the Russian army with target practice. By the end of the opening months, all 4 of Conrad's armies on the eastern front were almost destroyed and on the retreat, with some 400,000 casualties. You think this was bad, but an additional 120,000 men were under siege in the fortress of Przemysl. Conrad was determined to capture the fortress and relieve the garrison inside. Conrad and his German allies, actually managed to relieve the fortress for a brief time, but then the Russians counterattacked, Conrad counterattacked, and then his German allies retreated, more horrendous casualties were taken, and the fortress was under siege again. By this point, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had suffered somewhere around 700,000 casualties, but luckily Germany was able to mount successful attacks into Russian Poland. But unluckily for Conrad's men, his ego couldn't handle the fact it wasn't him getting all those glorious victories. So once again, he set his sight on Przemysl. To do this, he decided to launch an offensive on the most direct route, through the Carpathian Mountains. It was winter. Most of his men froze to death. This led to even more pointless casualties. He made even more pointless when the fortress surrendered in March 1915. This effectively made the Austro-Hungarian army unable to conduct its own independent operations, making it heavily dependent on the German army. It was so bad when planning the 1915 Gorlice-Tarnów offensive, Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn didn't even tell Conrad about it, fearing he'd do another vegetable-brained attack. It was only 3 weeks before the attack that he requested his support to guard his army's flanks, since Conrad obviously couldn't be trusted to mount a successful offensive to save his life. Despite this, the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive was widely successful and pushed the Russians back along a wide front, and it doesn't go without saying Conrad wasn't involved much. So while German successes seemingly got better and better, with both Serbia and Romania being defeated and the Russians being held off or pushed back, Conrad's and Austro-Hungarian army's luck only got worse. In 1916, Conrad's army was pretty much annihilated during the Brusilov offensive, in which the Russians, led by General Alexei Brusilov, completely smashed into the Austrian part of the Eastern Front, inflicting extremely heavy losses on the Austro-Hungarian. This, more than anything else in the war, marked the end of operational independence of Conrad's army, meaning that the Germans would have oversight over his struggling forces. After the Brusilov offensive, the new Austrian Emperor Karl I, finally having enough of Conrad being as useful as trenchfoot, finally relieved him of his role of Chief of Staff. He was then posted to the Italian front, where yet again he campaigned insistently for more reinforcements to go on an all-or-nothing offensive. I will admit this probably had the greatest chance of succeeding, but only because Italy and Austro-Hungary were in a rock-eating competition the entire duration of the conflict. But Conrad unfortunately just had to have his way one last time and one last failed offensive. This culminated in the Battle of Piave, which once and for all would destroy what there was left of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Conrad would finally be dismissed after this. All his miserable failures finally caught up with him. The Austro-Hungarian Empire would be completely dissolved after after the war, and Conrad would reside in Austria for the rest of his days. Surprisingly enough, a lot of Austrian historians at the time, ones on the more nationalist side at least, would heavily defend Conrad's actions prior and during the war, mostly for a roasting to look back at the glory days. Despite having many internal issues, it is quite possible that Austro-Hungary could have survived the war if it wasn't for having such awful leadership personified in Conrad von Hotzendorf. And that's it for me. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment and subscribe, and join the Discord. Bye.